This is America, and every day America is finding itself increasingly alone even among its closest friends. The U.S. wants NATO countries to do more militarily. Those same countries want the war to end. So is the U.S. losing its influence among its closest allies? Well, I'll be back later in the show with more on that, but first, Anna Burns-Francis.
Thanks, Manny. In just a moment, we'll be joined by our correspondents. Kimberly Halkett is live at the White House, and Theresa Bow joins us from near Washington's Freedom Plaza. But first, influence and military might. The two cards the US is laying out on the table to Europe as it tries to win the war with Iran. The US president's latest strategy is demanding his European allies send backup. Strangled by the Iranian shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, he wants a fleet of warships from his alliance friends to help free the backlog of oil and cargo that passes through the vital route. It's a route important not just to America, but to Europe as well. Responsible for 1/5 of all global oil traffic, the Strait has been a lifeline of supply for Europe since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But before another energy crisis has even had time to develop, a fracturing of the relationship between the United States and its European friends may pose a more imminent threat.
We don't need them, but it's interesting. I'm almost doing it in some cases, not because we need them, but because I want to find out how they react. I was very surprised with the United Kingdom. We've been with you. You're our oldest ally, and we spend a lot of money on, NATO and all of these things to protect you.
But any pressure to join the conflict directly is not working with European allies.
While taking the necessary action to defend ourselves and our allies, we will not be drawn into the wider war.
This is not Europe's war. Nobody wants to go actively in this war.
Like the United States and Israel, we want to see an end to Iran's nuclear and missile programs. But we will not take part in this war. We have said this from day one.
All right, let's go to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, who joins us now. Kimberly, some frustration coming out of the White House, but is Donald Trump still pushing for EU allies to join the conflict?
Yeah, there's no question the U.S. president still has a strong interest in having NATO allies as well as allies in Asia to join the conflict. What we're hearing from the U.S. president in his latest Truth Social post on Friday is that he is essentially name-calling now some of these members, trying to bully them into joining the conflict, calling NATO members paper tiger, and also complaining that they don't like the high oil prices, but they don't want to join the coalition to protect the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the U.S. president started this push for support about a week ago when he name-checked 7 countries on social media. And since then, he has been putting on the pressure, whether it's online or, as you played just moments ago, as he speaks at the White House to reporters. Essentially, the U.S. president is issuing an ultimatum to share the burden of protecting the Strait. And it closely aligns, again, with what we've seen all week. The U.S. president expressing real-time frustration and complaining that these allies are essentially not enthusiastic about joining the war. But the bottom line in all of this is that Donald Trump is also trying to downgrade NATO's relevance, given the fact that he has complained about NATO for some time. He's issuing a political threat to his allies, and also on Truth Social on Friday called them cowards for not participating. He is essentially issuing a diplomatic ultimatum and saying that not only are NATO members cowards, but saying we will remember.
Kimberly, thank you. That's Kimberly Halkett, our White House correspondent. Let's go to Theresa Bow, who joins us from Washington, D.C. And Theresa, we are starting to see some cracks here in the diplomatic relationship between the U.S. and its European allies.
Well, this is not the first time there's tension between the European Union and the United States, but the war on Iran and the situation on the Strait of Hormuz has definitely escalated, especially because of the economic impact. There's deep division, mostly about how this war started and also how European countries will commit to a war they did not start and they did not endorse. For many of them, they have been saying that this is not their war. And this is something that has angered Donald Trump, who's hoping to build a coalition. And he has gone as far as to say that the future of NATO is at risk. But for Europe right now, it's all about diplomacy. It's all about de-escalating, and also it's the possibility of evaluating a plan about what to do next. Again, this is not the first time there's been tension between the EU and the United States. We've seen the situation with the war on Iran. We've seen the situation on Greenland, and now is the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is shaping one of the most urgent security calculations for the United States. It's not only a lifeline for global energy markets, but also a test on Western unity, as European countries are reluctant to support the war in Iran.
The US has signaled an intent to mount a military operation to secure the flow of traffic through the strait, including using its navy to escort cargo. Since the US and Israel attacked Iran last month, Tehran has effectively choked the strait, weaponizing the waterway during the conflict. It has relied on a range of asymmetric tactics, including drones, naval mines, and fast boats equipped with limpet mines to control maritime traffic in the strait, which borders southern Iran. The US says it has been attacking the Iranian Navy in response.
The A-10 Warthog is now in the fight across the southern flank and is hunting and killing fast attack watercraft in the Straits of Hormuz. In addition, AH-64 Apaches have joined the fight on the southern flank, and they continue to work on the southern side.
President Donald Trump has urged Washington's allies to deploy naval forces to help secure it. It's become a loyalty test for the U.S. government.
You know, the problem with NATO is we'll always be there for them, but they'll never be there for us.
On Thursday, 6 international powers, including Britain, France, and Japan, said in a statement they were ready to help secure the safe passage. But for now, they have resisted Trump calls in the short term to deploy military assets. The UN says it's working on an evacuation plan for the thousands of ships stranded.
The war in Iran has now a new objective: to guarantee safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. It's also a test of US power and the limits of military solutions in a globalized economy that is on the edge. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera, Arlington.
Well, President Trump's characteristic strong-arm diplomacy faced blowback across the news media this week after the US president scolded NATO allies for failing to heed the call for an international coalition to secure that Strait of Hormuz. Let's go back to Manny in the newsroom for a look at how it's all been covered by the US News.
You can really see this divide playing out across U.S. news headlines, with articles zeroing in on a growing rift between the U.S. and its allies. Let's start with CNN. Straight to the point here, Trump lashes out after he fails to convince European allies to help in war with Iran. It goes on to say Donald Trump's brief and aggressive attempt to corral an international coalition to police the Strait of Hormuz concluded in disappointment. Now, let's hop on over to Fox News because the tone here is very different. The focus is on NATO sharing the burden of securing the Strait of Hormuz. Now, let's listen to this exchange between Fox News host Sean Hannity and retired U.S. General Jack Keane.
We're not going to send our own ships down there, Sean, if they're going to be sitting ducks to the Iranians. That's why we're not doing it right now. We want to remove that threat and bring the risk down to something that's quite manageable.
Yeah, well, General, it's sad to me because this benefits their countries way more than ours.
The tone from Fox News very much in line with the White House. But let's go over to the New York Times. They're looking into the attitudes from NATO. Why won't Europe help Trump in Iran? Let's count the reasons. New York Times breaks this down into 4 bullet points for us. Number 1, they, European countries, never wanted this war and don't want a part of it. Number 2, it's not NATO's job. 3, they don't think it'll work. 4, even if it did, it could prolong the war. This article outlines a very key point here, which is that even longtime allies are questioning not only U.S. strategy in the Middle East, but the end game. Let's hop on over to NBC. This is late night show host and comedian Seth Meyers. This is what he had to say about Trump's attitude toward NATO.
You called them obsolete, sloppy, and fat, and now you want their help? It's like breaking up with someone, then immediately asking them for help moving. I know I called you obsolete and sloppy, but I didn't say you were bad at carrying things. Now, hop to it, fatso. I got a date tonight.
All jokes aside, at the end of the day, these late night shows are how millions of Americans are getting their news. But let's head on over for one last headline from PBS. Trump's failed strong arming of allies on Iran shows that pressure is losing its effect. And that's the real question here, isn't it? Is the United States losing its influence among its friends? You can take a step back and look at all of these headlines, and there isn't a single narrative, but there is a common thread. The war isn't just testing America's military strategy in the Middle East, it's testing the strength of its alliances.
And those alliances have weathered tough times before, but that doesn't mean they're immune to long-term damage. Joining me to discuss today is Donald Jensen, a former US diplomat to Europe, and Heino Klinck, a former US Deputy Assistant of Defence to East Asia. Thank you both for coming in. Donald, I'll start with you. The US President has today called NATO allies cowards. Does he want them involved in the conflict or not?
Well, we have a crisis in the alliance, to be obvious. And I would say there have been many crises over the years, but this is really, I would say, given the geopolitical context, much worse than before. And in fact, we have a crisis ultimately of trust between President Trump, the White House, the U.S., United States, and Europe. This started over Ukraine. It started over a lot of other factors like misperceptions and disagreements about European security, and now it's gotten much worse. And this is unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. And in fact, to some extent, the sides are making it worse.
I want to get back to that phrase in crisis of trust in a moment. Heino, do you want to see European allies involved in this conflict?
Well, I think first and foremost, Europe, as well as in Asia, our allies need to rhetorically support American military action against Iran, because Iran was, in fact, a threat to not just European and Asian liberal democracies' values, but also to their interests. So I think rhetorically, the allies need to step up their rhetoric. Militarily, there are certain things that can be done, whether it's basing and access for American forces, and that has, in fact, happened already in Europe, although the Brits kind of begrudgingly provided access to the United States. Militarily, the reality is the United States has capabilities that no other country possesses, even within the NATO alliance. So where the NATO allies can help, great. But I don't think the United States is dependent. As a matter of fact, I know the United States is not dependent on military assistance from our NATO partners.
Not dependent, but certainly there appears to be, in the public messaging, an expectation. And Donald, if I talk to that point that Heino's just raised about this rhetoric that he would like to see from Europe, there is an argument that Europe has benefited from the security that the US has provided. Should there then be an expectation that if you are receiving that benefit, that you have to expect you will be asked to be included, and you should step up and put yourself forward when a conflict erupts on the doorstep of a neighbouring continent?
Well, that's true. But the problem is that there's this tension, these disagreements, these misperceptions that go all the way down throughout the alliance, an alliance which, frankly, has been in itself evolving in ways different than it's originally conceived. Different sets between Spain and Poland, different senses of security, different senses of what kind of a threat Russia is. And this means that while the natural, let's call it, process of U.S.-NATO relations has been evolving, but now it's been thrown into crisis because of this various factors, that lack of trust I mentioned, but serious disagreements about Russia, about what is European security. Now we're talking about maybe nuclear proliferation, as the French and others have talked about their own nuclear sides. These are not military issues only. These are geopolitical and political issues, as we used to say in the government, Paul Mill issues. And that means that all the sides involved, they have to really dig in to get some solutions to these new challenges. The challenges are new. They're not like the traditional Cold War sense of what the alliance would be.
Yeah.
And now the Iran war is becoming linked to the Iran war, to the Ukraine war, and it's becoming a greater conflict, partly because of the way the allies have, let's say, misunderstood each other.
We saw at the top of the show a bit of pushback there from NATO being involved, because there are a couple of layers here perhaps to explain to our viewers. There's, of course, individual European countries' response. There is a European Union, which of course is an economic alliance largely. It is not a military one. There is, of course, the NATO defensive alliance. And when we talk about NATO involvement here, it was never meant to be a defensive regime, alliance against any conflict in the Middle East. That was not its defining purpose here, Heino. So is this a redefining moment for the purpose of NATO? Do we need to reset the expectation around what NATO is for the future?
Well, that's happened before historically. I mean, after 9/11, for instance, when NATO, for the only time ever, and the only time the Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause was invoked, and NATO had deployed forces to Afghanistan. So it's not the first time that's happened, and I think. But
they have declined to take part directly in Ukraine because of Article 5, saying that is a reason they cannot get involved, and that war is on their doorstep.
Well, that's right, and I would argue that NATO, as an alliance within itself, and Donald alluded to this point, it's not necessarily a monolith. The view from Madrid is much different than the view from Warsaw.
Fair.
And it's always been the case. I would say, for instance, where we find ourselves today is not in a crisis. I mean, if we have a little bit of a historical perspective, I mean, let's think about what happened in the 50s during the Suez Crisis, for instance, where the U.S. backed Egypt against France and the UK. Let's think about the 60s as well, when the French pulled out of the military structure of NATO. And I even remember living in Germany in the 80s during the massive protests or when the United States was deploying new nuclear missiles into the region. This is not new. We've had discord within the alliance before, and this is just the most recent example. But to your point, yes, the alliance needs to be nimble, flexible, and agile enough to be able to contend with emerging new national security imperatives. And this is one.
There may be discord amongst them, but there certainly seems to be a fairly united message at the moment that they do not want to be directly involved in this conflict in the Middle East. And I'm wondering if this is their argument appears to be, to me, my interpretation, that joining this would be like bringing a gun to a gunfight. There's just an extra gun in the fight. This is not going to help resolve the conflict anytime soon. In fact, it will only prolong it and cause more chaos and confusion and issues in the conflict as it stands.
Yeah, I don't think I would agree with that assessment. The more guns you have in a gunfight, the better for you, quite frankly. That being said, the focus has been on mine countermeasures, for instance, opening up the Strait of Hormuz to international commerce again. I think those are all longer-term issues to contend with. I think we need to see first the end of kinetic operations against Iran before we can see a wider opening up of the Strait of Hormuz. And even if NATO countries, or Asian countries for that matter, were to deploy forces with that specific purpose in mind, that's not something you can just snap your fingers and happens next Tuesday. It takes a while.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge here is more rhetorical than substantive. Rhetorically, the United States and its allies need to be more on the same page. And I think we've seen that just within the last 36 hours, where we've had 7 countries say that they would be willing to take, quote unquote, appropriate measures in terms of operations.
That's an important point to pick up on, Donald, because today the United Kingdom has agreed for the US, just today, to use its bases to launch strikes when it directly relates to the Strait of Hormuz. That is an expansion of its involvement so far. Europe does need the Strait to be opened. So is there an argument that it is in its best interest to become involved if that is going to be the goal and the outcome, to get the Strait open?
Well, there's certainly an argument like that, and to some extent I would share it. But again, I would stress here that this is not just, adding to what my friend said, not just a military crisis. This is a geopolitical crisis, and I would argue almost civilizational, since you see, frankly, a contempt by a lot of people in the U.S. administration for a lot of European societies. Now, I'm not going to take one side or the other, but just to say this is a talk about values. This is a talk about more than just winning the war. Certainly, I think that the U.S. and its allies will wear down the Iranian regime. But this is a deeper problem that goes to a lot of issues that we've talked about in the past 15 to 20 years, but especially intensively now. And I would argue and point out that a lot of these countries that are, as you say, don't want to bring the gun to the table, these countries have domestic constituencies that British Prime Minister Macron and others, Merz, have to deal with, especially on their, let's call it, patriotic right.
Yeah.
And these are issues of how to deal with civilizational immigration. So for the first time, I think in a long time, the external challenge that the Iran crisis presents is now wrapped up in a way we haven't seen a lot recently in terms of the issues of where does Italy or France or Germany go. So this is requires a multidimensional approach to solve, to ease the problem, but above all requires cooperation. We don't see a lot of that right now.
Yeah, you mentioned there Emmanuel Macron, because breaking step somewhat with many other European nations, France's Emmanuel Macron has shown an interest in protecting shipping routes.
I reiterated that once the situation calms down, France is ready alongside other nations to take responsibility for a ship escort system in the Strait. However, we will not participate in any forced opening of the Strait in the context of ongoing military operations and bombings.
Once it calms down, Donald, what would be the measurement of once it calms down?
Well, that's a tough question, isn't it? I think in his own way, he's drawing a line in the sand there. And this line can be interpreted in various ways, but particularly the French, maybe the Brits, the Germans all have their leaders have all now strongly condemned the military action. And what I think Macron just suggested is a much more, not passive or benign, but much more non-military posture in the region, because ultimately the Hormuz issue is about the economies of their countries. And that's really, again, it's more than just a military problem. How you do that is the challenge. And I'm not sure how Macron would translate his rhetoric into practice. And that's really going to be the challenge.
Talking about translating that into practice, Heino, because we've already seen America's European friends are pretty unhappy. There's been US tariffs, the argument over Greenland, the stance on Ukraine. How does the United States convince Europe to become more involved?
Well, the question of burden sharing within the alliance has been perennial. It's always been. Every American president has, in one way or another, some more vociferously than others.
And to an extent, I would say Europe has perhaps admitted it while trying to hide beneath it a little.
I would say yes, absolutely. And again, my point being that some of these issues are coming more to the fore now, but this has always been the case. I think that we see, and we have a NATO summit coming up this summer. Let's see what comes out of that summit in regard, because I think it's going to be talking about more than just Europe and the North Atlantic. I think there'll be a portion of that summit that's going to discuss what's going on now in the Middle East and looking at further mitigating strategies where the United States can, in fact, count on European support. And I think, again, fundamentally what's important is that rhetorical, political, and diplomatic support. No European leader is going to be helped by using language that is only going to get a negative response from the U.S. president.
Can we talk about diplomacy and a negative
response? I could add just a point
please.
If Macron were here in your studio, I was sitting with the three of us, I would ask him, well, just how are you going to change this into policy? Going back to the beginning of the Trump administration last year, we've had Europeans, the question on the table has been, can the Europeans step up? First, it was about Ukraine, whether there was going to be a reassurance force, what kind of ceasefire there might be. And now we have the Iran crisis. And frankly, and I have family ties and many other friends in Europe, I still don't know the answer to the question, will Europe step up? In fact, I don't even know, as we said a moment ago, if there is a single Europe to step up. And that's some of the pressure on the alliance that we've seen.
There is pressure, when we talk about pressure on all sides and from many different quarters here. Conversely, the rising oil prices and a clogged Strait of Hormuz, it doesn't help Europe, does it? But it also, conversely, that doesn't help the US president. So is there a strategy here that either of you could see from Europe that holding off and allowing oil prices to rise and allowing that strait to close keeps the pressure on the US president to draw the war to a close instead of expanding it and including NATO, that just waiting does have some benefit? I know you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I don't see that, because just as there are domestic pressures on the US president to keep oil prices down and affordability to the best level possible, European leaders have the exact same issues and the exact same challenges, perhaps even more so because the European economies as a whole have not recovered from COVID to the same extent that the United States has. So I don't see that as being a point of leverage that would serve European interests.
Donald, does the US need Europe more than Europe needs to the US in terms of the Strait and what happens now?
I don't put any money on any predictions, but just if I could add to this one, the rhetorical contrast between Macron, Merz, van der Leyen, and Rutte yesterday, and Rutte's seen as a pro-Trump guy, I thought was remarkable and highlights the lack of a strategy by the Europeans. And I think that's going to continue, and I don't know how much pressure they can bring to bear on the crisis. Frankly, and I don't want to say that, but I have to say that, other than responding to President Trump's verbal pressure and doing what they can, perhaps it will end up being in the way that Macron wanted. And that's, I think, likely the way it's going to go. But these other problems we've talked about will remain.
Yeah, it's a timely point there, Donald, because the UK's Keir Starmer says there will be no way there will be a united NATO response.
Firstly, we are working with others to come up with a credible plan for the Straits of Hormuz to ensure that we can reopen shipping and passage through the Strait. Let me be clear, that won't be, and it's never been envisaged to be, a NATO mission.
Heino, what does this mean when we hear those sorts of comments? We talk a lot about the rhetoric but versus the action. Is this a tipping point for the way NATO decides to move forward? Can we expect unified response in the future, or will we see, as we have seen today in the 7 countries you pointed out, each country choosing to take a different stance, and that will just keep shifting as the conflict progresses?
So I don't think you're going to see NATO as the alliance dispatching forces, deploying forces into the Gulf. I don't see that happening. I think there may be individual member states that may bring capabilities into post-conflict operations. And actually that makes sense because there's some navies that have, for instance, mine countermeasure capabilities that other navies do not, including the U.S. Navy. So I personally believe that this is, a blip on the U.S.-NATO relations, and certainly not at the same level as others that we've seen before.
Okay, he's calling it a blip. Donald, last word to you.
Well,
does this change? Does this change the nature of U.S.
I would raise the question as well whether the Europeans will use this, I hate to say opportunity, this chance to raise pressure on other issues which may well be almost as concerning as Hormuz. In particular, the European clear displeasure with Trump's approach to Ukraine, that they might say, okay, we will help you, Mr. President, on Hormuz if you are more solicitous about Ukraine's military and economic needs. That could happen. But again, there's Vladimir Putin's out there somewhere in the Moscow area. And Putin may well, and I think he is, trying to use this as an opportunity to have a reconciliation more complete than the past few months with the United States. So Putin will be hanging around waiting to split the alliance, and I'm sure he'll do all he can to make that happen.
We'll save that one for another day. Donald Jensen, former diplomat, and Heino Klinck, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for East Asia. Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, the White House has embraced social media as part of its campaign to call out NATO allies. Here's Alex Baird.
Senator Lindsey Graham giving a look behind the Oval Office doors, saying he's never seen Trump so angry, all because of Europe and NATO's lack of support in the Gulf. Graham now questioning the value of those alliances. But the replies to that coming in hot and fast, saying, of course Europe wouldn't want anything to do with this. Trump now saying that any support from NATO is...
As far as I'm concerned, it's too late.
In a new Truth Social post, the president labelled NATO a paper tiger, saying his allies are cowards and that he would remember. Other conservative commentators backing Trump, saying statements like this from NATO are too little, too late. But that approach to Europe has split the Republicans. Congressman Don Bacon saying the tone from the White House is appalling and that the denigration of US allies has been terrible. Other voices telling the president he has gall to accuse NATO of having a very bad future, considering his threats over Greenland, Canada, and his lack of recognition over the bloc's troops. This video from conservative heavyweight Bill O'Reilly with a warning.
So the USA is alone in dismantling Iran, along with Israel, of course, but pretty much alone. And that is not a good situation.
A widening gulf between the US and its allies that O'Reilly says is not a good situation to be in.
Or what their potential.
That's all from DC. We head back to Doha.